Hey there, Tony. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Shannon.
Thanks for being here. Would you mind just introducing yourself real quick to everybody listening?
Absolutely. So again, my name is Tony Wilson. I'm a certified public accountant and a certified management accountant, and I provide fractional CFO services through my business Equip. And we specifically help software development agency owners build businesses they love without going bankrupt in the process.
That's the important part, is building a business you love without going bankrupt in the process, which unfortunately happens more often than we'd like to see. And I'm so happy that you're here and serving people like that. And I know you work with freelancers as well, right? This is another part of what you do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was talking with another friend of mine about this topic, and the way that I see it is freelancers are on a continuum of the type of people we work with, and especially in the software development agency world. Usually, a lot of these dev agencies that grow into the multi-million-dollar agencies all had similar starting points where they were freelancers, right? They worked in corporate America, and then they made their launch and they started freelancing for themselves. They eventually went on to do kind of a freelancer plus model and then build up a studio. And
Yep.
so the reason we work with freelancers, or the way that we work with freelancers, is primarily to provide good educational content so that you can save money and be more likely to succeed in matters of finance and business.
100%. I think education is the key to everything, but it's not always easy to educate and to do it in an approachable way, which is what obviously why this show exists. But talk to me a little bit about where freelancers in particular tend to struggle when it comes to implementing the financially savvy practices that they should be.
Yeah. Well, I think this is going to sound very, very woo-woo of me to say, but I think where a lot of freelancers really struggle is there's like a mind game that's being played, right? There's this inordinate fixation on it's bookkeeping, therefore it needs to be really complicated, or finances are really complicated. It scares me. And so even if the concepts are actually relatively straightforward or easy to approach, there's just so much baggage, I think, that a lot of people come to the table with. And so I think it tends to, I guess, hold people back from really understanding the key concepts.
Yeah, I would say it's an identity thing. Like people will assign an identity of like, I'm not a numbers person, I'm not good at this, and then live in that identity and therefore resist any type of content that's related to that. So saying like, oh, it's bookkeeping, like I'm not a bookkeeper, I'm not a numbers person, I'm not insert here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's key to understand that, I mean, you're also maybe not a business major and here you are running a business, or you're not an experienced manager, but you're hiring people. So we're willing to overcome that identity in some aspects, but I think we selectively choose to not overcome certain identities on the stuff that ain't so fun.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. Yeah, it's like we end up putting ourselves in these boxes. And one thing that I've loved building my own business, and I'm sure you can attest to this too, is once you move away from being kind of a technician, or you're working in corporate America, and you move now into small business world or entrepreneurship, boxes, they don't really exist. It's just whatever boxes you choose to put yourself in. And so, yeah, I'm a huge fan of break free of that mold and start embracing all of those titles.
Yeah, I think that's something it's also kind of scary if you haven't. I mean, if you have no formal education in it, and even if you do, it's still new. I mean, I went to school for business and accounting, and I started my own business. I was freaking terrified. So like, I can only imagine how it feels if you don't have that education or that background. And it's a lot, but I think that the key thing to your point is mindset. It's shifting that mindset into, I will figure it out. I'll be able to figure it out. I'm equipped to figure it out. People did it before me. Can't be that bad. And actually embracing the challenge of doing it. Would you agree?
Very, very much so. Yep.
Yeah. Now, bookkeeping is a big thing that people resist. Now, I always say there are two options. You invest your time in learning, or you invest in a professional to do it for you. There is no third option. And yet everybody chooses option 3 that doesn't exist, none of the above. Mm-hmm. Why do you think people avoid bookkeeping as a responsibility? Is it lack of awareness? They don't know they're supposed to do it? Or do you think it's just the intimidation? Like, where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, honestly, I think it's all of the above. I think I think everybody knows that it's a thing. I think there's just such little that's talked about what even is bookkeeping, right? So like we think bookkeeping and like, oh, that's something having to do with taxes. I'm like, no, no, no,
Mm-hmm.
no, no. Let me share a little framework with you, and hopefully this can alleviate that pressure for the listeners that are listening to this. The way that I look at bookkeeping, or the way that I look about accounting, is I'm like, it's not about math, right? Like first and foremost, accounting is the practice of storytelling. That's all we're doing, right? Like we are helping to craft a narrative and tell a financial story. That's it. And so if you can be a storyteller, which as an entrepreneur, you are a storyteller, plain and simple. If we can reframe away from this as being all about math and numbers and start thinking about it as like, we're just telling like what happened in our business from a financial perspective, I feel like a lot of that stuff starts to dissipate. So to your original question, like, what holds people back from doing it? I think a lot of it is just this misunderstanding and misconception. And then I think, it's this kind of mental constipation that happens. It's like the less that I'm able to do it, the less that I do it, the less I want to do it. And the more I just kind of avoid it and avoid it and avoid it. It's like that homework assignment that you put off to the very last minute, which we all experience because, we're coming up. We just finished tax time when the time this episode airs. And, you know it, you avoided it. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I always say it's kind of like the monster under the bed that turns out to be a mouse when you actually look at it, but you're so afraid to look at it because you think it's a monster. And it's kind of this like childlike, approach of, if I don't look at it, it stresses me out because it's probably this huge problem. And then you don't look at it because you're afraid of the huge problem. And then you realize it's actually a tiny problem that you've been avoiding for a long amount of time, but now it's a problem because of the avoidance. And it's actually this irony of, it was always a small problem. Time is the only thing that made it bigger.
That's right.
And I wish more people understood that it's only the fact that you're waiting. It's almost like exercising, like working out, right? Because it's like you will thank yourself for doing it sooner, even for a little bit. And I think a lot of people get intimidated, going into that intimidation route of, well, it's a lot of responsibilities and I don't know what I'm doing. How can people overcome the intimidation of, well, I could do bookkeeping, but like, where the hell do I start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man, I think about the saying, you eat an elephant one bite at a time. Like that's the only way that you can eat it. And I think the same needs to be said about how we approach bookkeeping. If our paradigm for bookkeeping is, the night before the tax deadline, well, then of course it's going to be overwhelming. Like I, as an accountant, if I was doing if I was doing my books the day before taxes were due for my business, like even though I don't have a huge practice, like for an entire year, that's a lot of financial storytelling and story writing to do. So I think, the first step in where do we even start is just break it down into smaller bite-sized pieces. The framework that I talk about in my course, the Tax Ready Freelancer, is I just have a 3-part cadence. We talk about write, review, report, right? If you think about accounting or bookkeeping as storytelling, we're going to write the story, we're going to review the story that was written, and then we're ultimately going to report it, because that's why we write stories, is ultimately to tell them to somebody. And so if we can follow that 3-part cadence of bookkeeping in our business, and we can do it systematically, right? So that we have our weekly tasks, our monthly tasks, our quarterly tasks, and our annual tasks. A lot of that stuff just becomes like, wow, that actually isn't that complicated at all. I think one of my favorite things to tell people, and it takes people by surprise a little bit, but I tell people, I'm like, you will spend more time on the toilet in a given month than it will take you to do your books.
I agree with that, actually. Yeah.
Right?
That actually makes sense.
I actually mathed it out. I'm like, okay, this shouldn't take more time than like the average American spends on the toilet.
Yeah. That is really interesting to think about, because I think people just get intimidated by not even the amount of time. I think too, it could be the amount of time spent. It will go faster than you guys think. It's very true. But the complexity of looking at this stuff and not understanding it, or where to start and approach it. I think people get intimidated by software like QuickBooks. They don't know how to use the actual platform. There are all these barriers to people getting it done because of whatever it may be, if it's intimidation by the software product or by the subject matter or by the sheer time it's been. How do you help people overcome that?
Yeah. Well, in the course that I teach, we actually even shy away from QuickBooks because I'm of the mindset that for a freelancer, if we're totally honest, like QuickBooks is kind of the killing a fly with a bazooka. Like you can do a ton of things with QuickBooks. Like it's capable of a lot, but for somebody who is a freelancer, like you don't need all those bells and whistles. And so what I turn people on to is an application called Wave. It's also an online platform. It is not going to be the fanciest thing out there, but it's free, so you can do your accounting on there for free. I do like its user interface a little bit better because I think it's a little bit more pared down. There's not a lot of those bells and whistles. So it's a little bit more straightforward to like understand. And I also like it because with it being free, it also feels like the stakes are really low for me to just try it out versus like my QuickBooks. Part of the reason why I avoid it as a freelancer is because I also feel this additional guilt of, well, I've been paying $60 a month for a platform that I'm not using. And so you just feel this like continued burden heaping up and up and up and up versus let's just go to Wave, sign up for a free account. We'll use it for free and learn it there. So I like to talk to people about Wave, but to your initial question, like how do you break through that, I guess, overwhelm for a new application? I'm like, yeah, you could look to YouTube. Or honestly, just like find creators like yourself and me who are talking about this and can teach people.
Yeah, I think it's finding the right person who can explain it and meet you where you're at, because there's a lot of people who will, like to your point, QuickBooks. I love QuickBooks. I'm team QuickBooks. And they even have a new product called Ledger, which is great because it's like an oversimplified QuickBooks, especially for accountants to use. But that's just the problem is that QuickBooks was by accountants for accountants. And it's not really for the person who doesn't understand accounting. So QuickBooks' solution was like, well, then you have to learn a little basic accounting. And I'm like, well, that's kind of the barrier. Like,
right. Yep. That's right.
So at least with Wave, and I've had experience with Wave, is like you don't have to be an accountant to understand what is actually happening. And it looks a lot like what you're used to seeing. Like if you're a digital creator or a freelancer, you're used to seeing Stripe, or you're used to seeing Upwork, or you're used to seeing these other platforms online that are kind of intuitive in terms of how they function. And Wave is very similar.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I even go as far as to say, in my course, I'm like, we don't even talk about debits and credits, right? Because I think like if we're saying debits and credits,
no need.
right. And honestly, we probably already lost you if we had to explain debits and credits. So, I think because we're able to teach Wave without talking debits and credits just speaks again to the fact that like, it's a pretty good platform for freelancers.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned, Tony, that like it's about telling the story, which I love. I use the same analogy. I would say it's about telling the story of how your money spent the year, and kind of in a children's book way. It's just like, so then what happened, and then what happened. But when it comes to the story, some people don't like the ending of their story, and they don't really like how the story is going. What is really important when it comes to telling that story? Really, it's kind of a two-pronged question. One is, how important is it to be doing that throughout the year and to be able to write that story ongoing versus writing it at the end of the year? Let's start there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost, I'd say at a minimum, you should be writing your story once a month. So if you're doing it only once a quarter, I feel like you already are a little bit too late. But you really want to be writing and reviewing at least on that monthly basis. Because, to your point, part of the reason why we get to the end of the year and we don't like the story that's being told is because we've not given ourselves that feedback loop to then course correct, right? Because that's where the power of financial storytelling comes into play, is when we speak it, when we put a bow on it, and then we look back on it and we say, oh shoot, I need to either be making more money here, I need to be cutting these types of costs, I'm overpaying that contractor for something. Like if it's already at the end of the year when you go to file your taxes, it's too late to course correct. So for sure, be doing this on a monthly basis, at a minimum on a quarterly basis to be able to course correct throughout the year.
Yeah, for sure. Let's talk too about the other side of my question was going to be the financial impact of that decision to do it at the end of the year versus throughout the year. Because I do believe there's also additional costs, not just in your time, but literally financial costs if you either wait till the end of the year or you rely on your tax preparer to tell that story for you.
Yeah. I mean, just practically, one thing that comes to my mind is, if you're waiting to the end of the year, you're also probably going to have to engage somebody else to do the writing of the story because it's just so overwhelming. I mean, again, by the time this episode airs, people will probably have had this experience where they had to scramble last minute and be like, all right, bookkeeper, I need you to just pull this together because my tax accountant needs it. Or worst case is that you go to your tax accountant and your tax accountant's like, all right, well, my hourly rate is $150 an hour and this is going to take me however long. And then they charge you even more than a bookkeeper would. These are things you just don't think about. So there's certainly the financial cost of just playing catch up in such a short period of time. And I'll just tell you this right now, like I've got a group of tax professionals, a community called Tax Minded Community. And, we're 40 some odd strong. And, one of the things we talk about when we talk about pricing is like, we always tack on a premium to the kind of the monthly fee if we have to do an entire year all at once, because what we don't want to do is we don't want to incentivize bad behavior. So we have to add a premium to doing a full year all in one sitting. We're never going to get a discount and we're not going to give market rate for that.
Yeah, but there's a reason that, the Super Bowl is about to happen. We're recording this around the Super Bowl time. Super Bowl is about to happen in Vegas. There's a reason why hotel prices in Vegas right now are expensive.
Right.
Demand, basic economics. Yeah. So it's basically there's only so many tax preparers who have so many hours in a day. The question is, why should they work on your stuff right now after you haven't done anything all year? That's right. And that's the truth of it, is like, why should we work on that? Or hotel stays, or name anything where the price will go up. Ticket prices to something, Taylor Swift tickets. Like there's only so many seats left. And we won't really bat an eye at the economics of those things. We go, well, that's just supply and demand. Mm-hmm. But the same goes for what we do, because, we're not trying to do bookkeeping in February for the prior year. Like we really don't want to. The way I say it bluntly too, Tony, is like you hired a publisher, they're expecting a manuscript. Mm-hmm. And if you go, I hired the publisher first, and it's like, where's your book? And it's like, oh, I thought you were going to help me write that. And it's like, no, we print it. Yep. Where's the manuscript? And then I wish more tax preparers educated in that way, because I think a lot of them do show up and just make it work in the name of client service. Yeah. And people don't know that this is something that's an expectation.
That's very true. And one of the other things you were just making me think right there is another financial implication or like cost that comes into play here is, if, let's say, you go through the year, you didn't write your story, and let's say you were lucky enough to be able to write it, after the fact, you're in February, March, whatever, you do it all at once, but you do it. Great. Good on you. But the financial cost there is, well, it's already too late for you to make the expenses that you need to do in the year to get you to the right, tax bracket that you were trying to target. So there's basically only, your contribution to your 401k or whatever, deferred retirement account. You can really only do that in order to adjust what your income is, versus if you're doing it throughout the year, you have much more ability to kind of pull different levers from a tax perspective to save money on taxes.
Yeah, I think that it's one of those things where bookkeeping has always been interpreted as a means to the tax return. And I want to shift that mindset today. And I want to go through bookkeeping is important to do throughout the year to tell the story. We've covered that. But why it's so beneficial to not just do it in the name of, well, I need to do this to do my taxes. What are the other benefits of having bookkeeping done throughout the year that people underappreciate when it comes to running their actual business?
Yeah. Well, maybe in order to answer that question, I'll frame it in one of the things we talk about in the course is in financial storytelling. The question we need to ask ourselves is, what are the stories that we write? But then we also have to ask the question, who do we tell the story to? And a lot of times the paradigm for our thinking about accounting or financial storytelling is, oh, we have to tell it to the government because tax. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's one. But really, there's
one reader.
Yeah, that's one area. The way that I categorize it, I'm like, I see it as there's three different audiences at any given time that you need to be mindful of, right? One is government. Yeah, obviously. There's four layers of government. There's not just IRS, by the way. You've got state taxing authorities. You've got local municipalities, all that stuff. Anyway, but government to the side, that's taxes. The second one would be management. And as a freelancer or as an entrepreneur, like that's you, right? You need that information to make better management decisions. The third category is somewhat applicable, is investors, right? Which if you're a freelancer, you're a solopreneur, whatever, you're both management and investor. And the needs there are slightly different, right? For an investor, I want to make sure that I'm investing my money well in this business. I'm not just throwing it down, and just getting a negative return every single year. Obviously, that would be on the investor side. But for management, I think, having good books could look like, I gave a couple of examples, but am I paying too much for that contractor or subcontracting out the work? A lot of the people that I work with in the software development space, they'll move their way up through being a freelancer to now tacking on some subcontractors. Well, if you've bid out a project that's a $10,000 project, but you just got finished paying the subcontractor $7,000 to do that. Maybe you didn't have to do anything with that work, but you paid them $7,000 to generate $10,000 worth of revenue. I'll just tell you this right now, that gross margin is not good enough, right? Like at a minimum, your gross margins need to be 50% if you're professional services. And so like those are the things you don't see if you don't have that information on a more regular and routine basis, where you can then course correct to say, all right, I made that mistake in March. It's now June. I'm not making that same mistake when I go to pitch my next client.
Yeah, and the analogy I use is you're spot on, Tony. And what I always say is, imagine if you're trying to control your weight and you're not weighing yourself and you're not paying attention to measuring your progress. But after a certain period of time, none of your clothes fit. And then you're like, what happened? What was I doing wrong? What I could have done differently? And then you go, wait a second. If I had been keeping track of what I was doing and then figuring out the outcome and its relationship to what I was doing, I could have changed my behaviors. I could have changed my habits. I could have gotten ahead of this proactively and made different decisions. And I think that's where a lot of small businesses actually fail, is that they wait until the ultimate feedback of it didn't work. And they get too deep into the it didn't work state, where it's really hard to recover from, a long time of, we'll say, bad habits versus attacking those right when they start showing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Or worse yet, they're only ever going to look at their current day's bank account balance as a marker of whether or not they're successful. I'll just tell you this right now. If you're in any type of services work and you get upfront retainers, like, you might be under the impression that, wow, I'm doing so great. I've got $200,000 in the bank. Little do you know that $150,000 is something that's supposed to feed you for the next 5 or 6 months. Again, you don't know that stuff if you're not looking at your financials on a regular basis.
Yeah. And let's talk about too, a lot of folks say that, because I've always said that there's the two options, right? Hire a professional or learn how to do it yourself. I think we've kind of broken a lot of the myths around, like, okay, if I learn how to do it myself, I don't have to learn the science of it. I can just do it myself and learn the need to know steps. And it's pretty straightforward in terms of a simple recipe to cook. But let's talk about hiring a professional, because there are a lot of folks out there who might say, look, I really just want to hire this out and not deal with it. How much does the bookkeeper actually cost me? And is it worth hiring someone really early on in my business? Or should I really learn how to DIY?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I have a pretty strong opinion, which is why I created the course that I created, which is, I feel like when you're early on, quite frankly, I just don't know that your business can afford it. Like if you're making, certainly if you're making under $50,000 a year as a freelancer, like it's just does not make sense for you to have somebody else do this. I mean, typically, if you're looking at a big box option, I'm not going to mention the names, but there's a couple big box options that are, $250 to $300 a month. And that's scraping the barrel. I'll just tell you this right now. I've heard of people who've gone that solution, and you kind of get a mixed bag. You might get a great person, or you might get a really terrible person who really screws things up for you. And by the way, you're still out that money and you still need to have somebody else come in and pay it. So you're going to have to pay extra money for that anyway. So I'd say $250 to $300 a month. So I put that at about $3,000 or more a year that you're going to be spending if you're going to be hiring a bookkeeper to do that for you.
Yeah, at a minimum, I would say a really good one, I would say costs north of $500 a month.
Agreed.
And it's challenging to afford. But also, I think what I want to expose listeners to is it's not always like cut and dry, like black or white, one or the other. There is an in between where you could DIY a bit and then engage a bookkeeper to come in and check your work, right? Like there's a lot of in between gray area, because I think people say, oh, I can't afford to hire a bookkeeper yet. I said, well, you could jump on Wave, join Tony in his course. You could learn the basics of how to do this on your own. And just for the sake of peace of mind, hire someone in November, December-ish, pro tip, not January, November and December, to say, hey, anything that's like standing out, glaring, anything I need to be course correcting, anything I need to see, like, is there something that I'm missing here in terms of the story I'm telling, anything I can do right now? I think that would be a great way to engage a bookkeeper, start a relationship, but without having to have a massive price tag. Like there's an in-between somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw that service. I'm glad you mentioned it. I saw that service, and a friend of mine who she focuses exclusively on FreshBooks, the platform FreshBooks. That's her specialty. But that's essentially the service that she offers is, she's got her community of people who use FreshBooks, and they can come to her. She's kind of like a coach, a mentor, and just kind of giving them some guardrails. So like you said, it's a much more affordable option. Because you're still the one in the driver's seat, but then you just have that extra layer of comfort and review over top. It's a good option.
Yeah, we do something similar with CFO On Demand, right? We have, you can come to me with your questions and so on. And it's a great option for when you just need that little extra guidance too. Because I think that one of the barriers to DIY is like, well, what if I'm doing it wrong? And if we just add those guardrails in and say, you're not doing it wrong, you're doing a great job, keep going. Sometimes that's all they need. It's just the peace of mind knowing that I'm moving in the right direction. So we've covered a bit about the financial investment in proper bookkeeping, the financial impact of not having proper bookkeeping. I think you mentioned it too, but it goes without saying that like you're probably actually going to pay more in taxes as well if you don't have good bookkeeping, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, absolutely the case. I mean, again, especially if you think about wanting to maximize your deductions in a given year, you're going to have no idea what that is unless you're keeping your books on a regular basis and you have a sense for where you're going to land from a profit perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Or if you can take advantage of certain strategies. I always say like, for an S Corp, for example, we always say that like you should start that conversation with your accountant when you're north of 50,000 in profit. Now it'll depend on what state you're in and all these other factors, but we say start the conversation, Mm-hmm. And a lot of people say, I don't even know if I'm there. Mm-hmm. They'll say, I don't know if I have, like, do you have 50,000 or more in profit? And they go, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I say, okay, let's rewind. Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the awareness of where you're at in your journey. So you know if you're missing these steps along the way where you could take advantage of strategies.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, let's talk about maybe, are there any other benefits you can think of for a freelancer or for an early stage business owner when it comes to bookkeeping, unpacking this, telling the story, the tax benefits, the compliance, obviously the stay out of trouble side of it, like, I just need this done to get my taxes done. But what other successes have your students seen from finally embracing the idea of doing their own bookkeeping?
I think there's a level to which, when you're in there and you're writing your financial story and you're really hands-on, the things that are going in and out of your bank account, you take the abstract feeling of like, from a gut level, I feel like I'm losing money, or I feel like things aren't going well, or I feel like things are going great. It takes it from being this abstract kind of subconscious pressure, and it brings it into like a concrete, it's out in front of you. You can put your hands on it. And I think, honestly, like, I think this is something we just don't really talk about in entrepreneurship very much, but as it stands right now, we already have so many weights and burdens on our shoulder. The last thing we need right now is to have this like looming doubt of like, I feel like my business is going down the tubes, like when you're in the nitty gritties and you can see like what is going in and out, and you understand what's happening in your profit and loss statement and this kind of stuff, you might have the same conclusion as what your gut felt before, but now you can point to numbers that objectively tell you whether or not that's true. And furthermore, if you're well educated about what those things mean, you can now make better decisions. So I think it's just like a matter of empowerment, and again, taking weights off your shoulder to make them more tangible and more real in front of you.
I agree. I think I've actually experienced that with entrepreneurs myself, where they'll say, I feel like I'm not making money. And like, you feel like you're not making money, or like the bank account says you're not making money. Like what is telling you you feel that way? And they'll say, well, instinctively I feel this way because of whatever things that they're observing, right? Mm-hmm. I've had this happen so many times where people aren't even aware of where the money's coming from or where the money's going out, mm-hmm. what their most profitable offers are, where they're spending their time. They're spending their time on money sucks instead of money creators. Yeah. And they're actually not focused on or aware of the fact that there's an offer out there that's costing them more than what they're making. That's but right. Because they're so busy doing it, they're equating that to, well, I must be making money from that because I'm spending all my time doing it.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a really, really good point, right? Because like I was just having a conversation. They're not a client of mine, but they're friends of mine. I was having a conversation, and as we were digging into their client list, what we found was a couple of their clients were subsidizing the really, really poor performance of some of their other clients. So because they didn't necessarily know the nitty gritties of like where they're actually spending their money, they were just like, well, I think we're kind of semi-profitable, but they didn't realize at the time that it was really just a couple really stinker clients that they should have fired. They have since fired, that were just dragging things down. And again, you don't know that if you're not in the books.
Yeah. And as we kind of wrap things up here, I wanted to pose this question to you too, because we talked about, hiring a bookkeeper or investing in the resources. And I want to talk about, a bit of how people can decipher and distinguish the right help that they need. So looking for the right professional or program or whatever it is, what advice do you have when it comes to somebody who's saying, okay, I get it. I need to tell my story better. I need some help with this. Give them some advice on where they can turn or what they should be looking for in terms of qualities or features or benefits of what they should be focused on as they start on this journey.
Yeah. Well, especially if you're thinking about engaging a specialist, I think, Shannon, the $500 threshold that you talked about, I think is absolutely spot on. If you're spending less than $500 a month on somebody, it should be warning. There should be some red flags. And I would say, again, looking at somebody who's going to be doing the work for you, a couple things that I would be looking at if I were the person in your position is, number one, does this person have some type of specialization in my industry or my niche, right? Like, especially if you're e-commerce, if you're a drop shipping, whatever business, like I would not just pick any old bookkeeper. I would really make sure that you're working with somebody who has experience and who they can point to. Yeah, I have, these 3, 4, 5, however many clients that they do work with. I think another thing that I would be really mindful of too is like, how long have they been doing this? Is this something that they just started during the pandemic because they wanted to piece out from their corporate job and like now they're doing, you know what I mean? Like, versus somebody who has lots of experience doing this, whether because they worked in corporate America in this type of function and now they're doing this on their own, or they've just been doing it for 10, 15 years, whatever. I think that's another really important thing I'd be looking for. And then I think the other thing would just be specifically on the bookkeeping front is how well connected are they with other tax professionals? Like, do they have a working relationship with those tax people? And why that is so important is because the handoff between a bookkeeper and a tax accountant makes all the difference, right? Like, if this person is just kind of like is known for just dropping things in the tax accountant's lap and not providing any context, not like helping them navigate this stuff, they've burned bridges because of stuff like this before. Like, that's not a bookkeeper you want to be with. You want a bookkeeper who has a flourishing relationship with multiple tax professionals. You want the type of bookkeeper that the tax professionals are like, please go and work with this bookkeeper. Like those are the gold. Like even if they cost a little bit more money, you will be well worth your investment if you choose those types of bookkeepers.
I completely agree, especially if you don't like really interacting with the CPAs, the tax pros, the bookkeepers. Like you don't like facilitating those conversations. I always say, I do not want to make you Andy Cohen on the couch between the Real Housewives of Atlanta, because dead serious. I was like the two couches. I picture this visual of like the tax pro and the bookkeeper. The tax pro is like, put it under miscellaneous. And the bookkeeper's like, I don't usually do that. I put it under this or whatever. Like there's always these different like nuanced approaches to how the accounting's done versus how the tax gets presented. Yes. And then they disagree. And then they're like, business owner, what should we do? And you're like, I hired y'all for a reason. I don't want to be involved in this. And it's always better when those two people are in sync and they have the same approach, or at least they understand the approach of the other person. I always say, try to find a team as much as possible. The first place you should go to find a bookkeeper is your tax pro, to be like, who do you work well with? Yeah.
Yes, very much so. And the using something that I love about your show is that it's very approachable. So I'm going to use a real life example of like something that's analogous to what we're talking about here. So I have to go into the dentist every like 3 or 4 months because I've got teeth stuff. Anyway, I have been very picky, not about my dentist, but very picky about my dental hygienist, because I realize that my dental hygienist is the one that I am with on a regular basis, day in and day out kind of stuff, right? Now, the dental hygienist and the dentist need to get along really well, but it's the dental hygienist that's going to make or break my experience, because the dentist I'm going to see for like a fraction of a second. It's the dental hygienist I see all the time. It's the same thing when you think about a bookkeeper and your tax accountant or your CPA. So pick somebody also that you're going to get along with, somebody that you enjoy as a person.
Yeah. And their expertise is obviously paramount. I think that a lot of people will go with convenience or like the first bookkeeper that crosses their desk that's in their network, but like actually vet them, actually see if they meet the values, the qualities that you actually want in a bookkeeper. It's actually a really important person that you're going to spend a lot of time with, to your point, Tony, that you want to be intentional about who you're surrounding yourself with, who's advising you, and who has access to your numbers. The way I say it is, they're going to see you financially naked. You should actually trust them. You should actually want to work with them and not feel uncomfortable doing that. If you have a preference, look for that preference. Like if you're a female business owner and you really want to work with a woman just because it just makes you more comfortable to talk about this stuff with another woman, go for it. That those types of things are important because it's going to help reduce that barrier to getting the stuff done, as we keep talking about, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to be specific. But if you are trying to, get started, you're in your first 6 months, a year, maybe you're trying to make your first 100K. Tony has a great resource for you in this Tax Ready Freelancer program. Can you just talk a little bit about that and, who it's right for and how people can learn more?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the ideal person is a freelancer or solopreneur. And like you said, under $100,000 in revenue is probably the right time. Usually once you get just above $100,000, you start getting into that category where it's like, okay, maybe it makes sense you have more valuable things to be doing in your business than to be doing your books. But certainly under $100,000 a year in revenue, you want to be trying this, DIYing this yourself. And kind of the value proposition here is, you can be saving $3,000 or more a year by just DIYing your books. And like we talked about earlier in the podcast, like this should take you less time in a given month than you're going to be sitting on the toilet in that month. So it's a very low barrier to entry. I speak in very plain terms. We're not talking debits and credits. We're talking just real world speak here. And the overall course, it's 2.5 hours worth of video content. So we're not talking like days and days worth of you studying. But so the Tax Ready Freelancer course, you can go and check that out. I think we're going to have, you said, a link in the description. And I think right now it's $150 or $149. But if we go through, I think there's a coupon code that we'll be providing to the listeners of this show. So sign up with that. You'll get a 10% off the course if you go that route.
Fantastic. So really we're talking about under $150 to learn the basics that you need to avoid paying $500 a month. I mean, who wouldn't want to sign up for that, right?
Right. Exactly. It's a no-brainer.
Amazing. Yeah. And spending less time than you would spend on the toilet to make it happen. And that's the big thing. Exactly. So, Tony, thank you so much for joining me today. I've enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for reiterating what we talk about a lot in this show. But I think having other voices to repeat it and that also get it is always appreciated. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me on the show. I've loved our conversation today.